Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the first 2 years, specifically cognitive development. The book opens up approaching hearing. The idea is the ears, once they begin to form, vibrations start to occur. So, yes, even in the womb, babies have some concept of hearing. They can hear the vibrations, get a sense for the rhythm. They can get a feel for their mother's voice, get a feel for the mother's language. All this is happening in the womb. But once they are born, their hearing itself is very acute. Okay. Infant ears can sense all noises. However, they ignore most upon what they hear and they focus upon the human voice. And throughout this chapter, this is going to be a major theme that we are all, I hate to say the word, but kind of determined when you look at deterministic theory. How does our biology drive us? We are more interested in human voices, human faces than we are in other objects. And this is built into us from the beginning. Okay. So babies are taught to, not taught, but they are innate. Later on, we'll talk about how they're taught to focus on our voices. But again, they innately focus upon human voices. Okay. All humans are born with the innate ability to learn languages. Okay. And then from the beginning, babies, they start to perceive these tiny differences in language and universal, and this is what they call babies as universalists. Okay, so babies are very, very perceptive when it comes to language and what they're listening to. They already are picking up on, the grammar, the syntax, the rhythms, the sounds, the pauses, when it stops. Okay. By about 6 months, babies are specifically attuned to their native language and they prefer it. So we've done studies on this, and it turns out that babies, show preferential responses to hearing their own language over other languages. Okay. And then there's a word that's used called entrainment. That's what the book says, meaning to get on board with the rhythm of the language. But again, right from the beginning, babies are using their ears to pick up the grammar, the syntax, the flow of the language, how it sounds, and so they're already using their ears to pick up on this. When it comes to vision, objects, and faces, very young infants spend most of their awake time looking around. Babies want to see things. Your book even says if you want to quiet a baby that's crying a lot, take them and show them all kinds of different things. Take them out in the world, take them to different rooms, take them and show them different objects. It says take them to see traffic on the streets or dogs coming to be petted, toys that move. These are the book suggestions to how to calm a fussy baby. Okay, babies want to use your eyes. They are just designed to do that. 3 months old, look at whatever is likely to advance their understanding. Okay. So babies do gaze on their own, regardless of direction from caregiver, but they're also highly focused on whatever it is the caregiver is pointing out. Babies are born to just stare out in the world and take in the information. And again, this is kind of the idea of kids being like sponges. Okay. So at first, the baby's getting all this stimuli from their ears, the taste, the eyes, and then the brain has to start to categorize this information. So as you start to learn the language, it picks up on the syntax of the language, those language parts of the brain, like the Broca's area or whatever we're going to look at later, those start to grow, and our schematic knowledge, like our schemas, our memory grows, and so rinse and repeat. When you hear a sound a bunch of times, eventually you start to pick up on it. But that's when this is starting to happen. So babies are just kind of sitting back, chilling, taking in all the stimuli, and their brain is slowly coding all this information. Okay. Your book gets into the Broca's area, but it also gets into this fusiform face area of the brain. And so if you look in the book, or actually I had to Google it when I was looking up to see where the fusiform brain areas of their brain, but back here is where, parts of the brain that are already exist, to take on this information. Newborns are quicker to recognize a face that they have seen just once than our older children and adults. Babies are very, very perceptive of faces. Your book starts to get into some interesting things like natural pedagogy, and this is the idea that all parents kind of have this inborn innate desire to teach children. And so it's evident that when the caregivers direct the baby's gaze, calling their name, pointing at an object, and so on, this does stimulate the child to look at it. But again, the baby is very on its own, will also just gaze and take in information. Adults do not need to be taught this pedagogy. They do it naturally. That's one approach. Yes, we all may have this inherent ability to want to teach our babies and socialize our babies. But again, not everyone has the same level of skills or investment times. And so, even if we're born on this, having some training on parenting really does help, okay? But very young babies do respond by looking at whatever the adult shows. And again, this, adult and baby interaction, or peer and baby, or sibling and baby, or whoever is interacting with the baby. The idea is the babies want stimuli. They want to hear things. They want to see things. They want to smell. They want to taste. They like it when we use words to describe things. They are born with this desire to learn and figure out the world. So logic and knowledge. Already at 12 months, infants stared a second or two longer when the flower was surreptitiously replaced with the dinosaur than when the flower was still there. Your book gets into all these really cool experiments, and then it shows you at what point does the brain actually start to figure out things like object permanence and replacement and something being a little bit off and not making sense. And the book goes so far as to say that it's very possible that we are all born with this basic understanding of physics and core knowledge, which is interesting. So again, your book talks about what happens when you replace a dinosaur and a flower and you swap them out and then you pretend like nothing happened. Does the baby pick up on this stuff? And it says by about 1 year they already do. Apparently, they already know how things should be and are surprised when their basic understanding is wrong. So again, if you present a baby with the flower and the flower's there, but then you swap it out with the dinosaur, the baby will look at it like, hold on, something's changed. This defies my logic. Many other events that are contrary to the usual way things work, such as a ball that hangs in the air rather than falling, or a toy that becomes two toys, elicit the same surprise. Again, when something is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, by about a year, the babies start to pick up on this. Many developmentalists believe that infants have this innate form of logic or an inborn understanding of kind of the way nature itself works. And then there's a great quote that scientific reasoning may not be a hard-won accomplishment mastered later in life, but rather an inherent attribute of the mind. Are humans born with this ability to logic out and make sense of reality? And when things don't match up with the natural laws of physics, like, that dinosaur was there and now it's a flower, what up? Are we born with this ability to pick up on that? And again, you could say that, again, through evolutionary psychology, the latest part of our brain is the outer cortex of our brain, which is where our higher reasoning skills exist. And so, again, maybe we are all born with this ability to make sense of reality. So, core knowledge includes the understanding that gravity makes objects fall, that moving objects are stopped by a solid wall, and that adult gaze signals important information. It's argued are these things that we all have built in. The book even talks about snakes, and it says things like, we all have this hesitation when we go to see a snake, but of course, it really does take the social learning, to say that snake equals danger. But again, in our DNA, we're born with this basic hesitation towards snakes. So is that like a built-in logic that there's some kind of a danger in the environment that we should be aware of? And again, this is the idea that experience in the end is what informs preference. Okay. So with experience-dependent learning babies, babies smile more readily at familiar people, differentiate men from women, and distinguish among faces of their own ethnic group. And then the book asks this really great question. Is this worrisome? Are humans naturally sexist and racist? No. The idea is babies get comfortable with whatever they're surrounded by, and however, we instruct them that this is the acceptable way of being. And you can ask, is there a motherly way of behaving and a fatherly way of behaving? And babies, do they prefer their mothers because mothers prefer, and engage in that more motherly way of behaving? And then when it comes to things like ethnicity, we prefer the things that we get comfortable with. And so the book basically says here in the end, humans that are to become At ease in a multi-ethnic, multi-gender world, caregivers need to let babies see friendly interactions among people of all appearance. So the general idea is babies get comfortable with whatever they're exposed to. You get used to your surroundings. And of course, this idea of in-group, out-group, is that built into humans? That's not something I really even want to address at a time like this, but we do have our cultural preferences for language, cultural preferences for food types. But again, a lot of this is socialized. And so when we get into cultures that go beyond what we're naturally socialized into, do we get uncomfortable for various different reasons? So it's not that a baby prefers someone so much of their own ethnic group, you know. The idea is babies prefer whatever they are exposed to and they become comfortable with. As with almost every infant development, experience combines with inborn instincts, evident not only in newborn humans, but also in all primates. Babies look intently at every face-like image at first, but soon they zero in on the faces that are most important to them. So again, we kind of become obsessed with those significant others in our lives. We get used to things that are the way, things are. We kind of like our comfort zones. So brains are primed to pay attention to familiar faces. The preference for women and their own race effect, these result from experience in the socialization process. And then your book goes on to say, indeed, children who are of one ethnicity that are adopted by another ethnicity, they end up preferring that other ethnicity because that's the ethnicity that they tended to be raised around. So again, I brought this in here just to introduce some interesting questions, and your book does a pretty good thorough job of looking over that. But when it comes to learning, of course, again, babies are just inherently curious. They want stimuli. They need stimuli. They have to be socialized in order to be developed into fully contributing citizens, or however, self-actualized people, or however you guys want to put the standard for, like, the average human development. So again, this curiosity is inborns. Newborns look at, listen to, suck on, grab, and taste anything and everything they can get their hands on. Then the book gets into parenting styles, and it discusses, how some babies are allowed to just go out in the world and put their hands and feet on anything they want to, and some are much more structured. And it gets into, a little bit of the pros and cons about both approaches. But again, the idea is in maybe some kind of a structured fashion, children, babies need to go out, experience the world, get punched in the face with stimuli, not with abuse. Right now, I'm working on a project because, babies are the most likely to be abused of any group. That's 0 to 1. So what's going on with their parents? So if you have a bunch of parents that are stressed out, they're beating their kids, they're not really interacting with them in positive ways. Again, these kinds of things affect development, but it also affects things like intelligence. If you sit there and you stimulate and you give babies just tons of information and kids tons of information, and you get them working at stuff, then they really do develop much of, more thoroughly, which can show on, forms of intelligence tests and things along those lines. So adults should let children see them struggle. There's also another idea that kids, if they see people struggling with the task that they themselves are going to struggle with, they tend to spend more time doing that. If the baby learns that hard work pays off, that becomes a learning strategy that encourages them to practice whatever skill they want to master. It's like my daughter's always doing Lego. Sometimes she freaks out and has a heart attack. Then she watches me go struggle with it, and eventually I get it kind of figured out. And then she, after that, somehow finds her way back to it. I don't know if I'm helping her or not, but, at least she sees me struggle. Okay, so then at least she's learning that learning takes effort. Okay. Now, again, our parenting styles, their genetic temperament, all this influence, our overall grit and our overall temperament across our lifespans. So you can generally think about your grit, temperament, personality as half of it's the genetics, the rest of it's your psychological observations, your thinking, your perceptions, your experiences, and then, the social context and how that structures and influences you. Okay. But we are highly influenced by the caregiving approach, and the book suggests that, the main thing that babies really need, aside from love, care, and tenderness, is just, and food, is, some stimuli to be challenged a little bit. When it comes to memory, we start to dig into Piaget and Freud and other early developmentalists. The idea is that and this is what the early theorists were saying, think about when your earliest memory is. What age does it actually start? Is it about 3 or 4, or do you have anything that comes before that? And so your book gets into explicit versus implicit memory. And so explicit memories are associated using verbal or words, and then implicit memories can be nonverbal memories of movement, emotions, or impulses that were never put into words. And so, most likely, if you think back to your earliest memories, they're probably implicit memories. Like it's a picture, an image, a place that you were, a general aura of how you were feeling at that time when you were in the car looking at that place or whatever it might be. It's not until later that we start to use memories to encode our language to encode our information. So the way I often like to think about it is this. Your book gets into this idea of infant amnesia, the idea that people forget everything that happened to them before their age 2. It's not so much that we forget, it's just that when a baby is born, it has a non-verbal coding system for coding all your memories and information. But then as you learn language, then your brain starts to use language as a memory cue and then structures your schematic language knowledge based upon that. So arguably those early memories are still there. It's just that you're trying to use words to access some kind of a memory cue. But you would, in order to really access that memory cue, you almost have to go to that place. So chances are if you're like trying to remember your childhood just by trying to use words and think back and what it's like, it's not going to be as easy. But if you go show up at your childhood home and just stand there like in your front yard or you walk through the rooms, you get like a general sense of everything that happened to you early on. But again, that's the idea is that our coding system for memory goes from nonverbal to more of a verbal memory. Not that we don't always use both, but again, once you learn that language, language is so built into our brain that humans use language to structure our thoughts, our memories, encode information, anything along those lines. So your early memory system, which is nonverbal, switches over to more of a verbal memory cue. And then once you kind of do that, then you lose that connection with those parts of the brain. But again, it says, however, unconsciously and implicitly, these memories from your, 0 to 2 and then, 0 to 4, when you really start to, memorize using words, they're probably still somewhere deep in your brain. You just lost the ability to recall that information. You don't have that cue anymore to recall that information. But then your book says things like a person might have an irrational fear of doctors or hospitals because of some early terrifying and painful experience that even if they can't consciously remember, somehow it's stuck with them ever since they were a baby. Okay, so it's not that these psychologists like Piaget and Freud were wrong to saying that infants have amnesia and we forget. It's not, it's just that it's more along the lines of like those are long-term memories. If they're there, they never go away. It's just that we can't access those memories. Okay. Great. Just to wrap it up, your book did get into this really cool experiment and where they would lay a baby down and they would put like a ribbon up above that baby, and then the baby would like kick at it, and then it would I can't remember if it got a reward. Doesn't matter. It would kick at it, and then they would go back the next day and like see if the baby would remember it. And oftentimes the baby didn't remember it until you showed it the ribbon a second time. And then once it saw it a second time, then it kind of remembered things, which kind of leads us into what we're going to get into next, which is these theories of learning. But before we kind of get into that, we'll look at Piaget's sensory motor intelligence. And again, I'm really critical of a lot of these stage theories because are they accurate in modern times? But I put them up here because you'll always get this in all of your psychology classes looking at these stages. But Piaget breaks down the sensory motor stages into the primary, secondary, and tertiary. And so your primary is, stage 1 comes from birth to 1 month and then to 1 to 4 months. And this is when the infants respond to their bodies. And then he gets into the stage 2, which is 4 months to about a year. And this is when we start to respond to objects and people. And then we can get into stage 5 and stage 6, which lasts from about 1 year to 2 years. And these are our creative stages when we start to mix action and then ideas. Okay, so early reflexes, senses, and body movements, these are the raw materials for infant cognition. Again, just kicking off here in the primary. This is what he called the cognition in the first 2 years of sensory motor intelligence. And then he subdivided this into 6 stages. And then again, babies about 2 years old learn object permanence. That means that, you can take an object away or hide it, then they kind of know where it is after that. Okay, let's get into things like Vygotsky. So Vygotsky was really interested in the sociocultural approach. So again, what happens if you invest a lot in a kid? What if you stimulate a kid? And he's the one who comes up with the idea that, if you really want to make a kid rocket scientists, naturally they can be smart, go out in the woods, figure out how the world works, yada, yada, yada. But if you teach that kid a bunch of tricks, techniques, really teach them math and all these other interesting skills, how far can the brain go? And maybe that's infinite is kind of the argument. But Vygotsky stresses that other people play a role in shaping infant cognition. So we all have agents of socialization, people that have taught us stuff, taught us about our culture, our values, our beliefs, social norms, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to behave. And this is what we call joint attention. So joint attention is that infant and caregiver or whoever it might be, brother, sister, peer, just anybody out in that social context that they're interacting with, this joint attention, interacting with others is really how babies learn. Again, by using their ears, by using language, by trying things out, by doing play, taking the role of the other later on. This is how kids learn to become those fully productive humans or those humans seeking out their self-actualization in their own way, or however you guys want to describe it. But we need attentive, undistracted caregiving. Most importantly for this, though, it's all about brain growth. So again, if you really want to make a kid super smart, you got to challenge that kid, put information into their head, and there's all kinds of intelligence. So again, whether it's music intelligence or just being able to tell jokes or math skills or artistic intelligence or just, being able to do engineering or whatever type of intelligence, that the kid is into, the idea is we need, by growing the brain, the only way to really do that is to have that social investment. So it's through social investment, agents of socialization, interacting with these babies and kids that can really enable them to develop and grow their brains. And again, you want to increase the IQ, that's the best way to do it, especially depending upon the test. But if you're going to do an IQ test that's mostly formal education, how do you get good at that? Well, you have to spend a whole bunch of time doing formal education. You want to do a test that's testing music. Well, how do you do it? Well, you spend a whole bunch of time doing music and maybe you'll be good enough. Okay. So when it comes to languages, infants react to tone and frequency. By 7 months or so, they respond with some comprehension of the meaning of words that are distinctive, such as bottle, doggy, and mama, but they haven't quite figured out words such as baby, Bobby, and Barbie. Infants also really like alliteration, rhymes, repetition, melody, rhythm, and varied pitch. So again, having fun and doing a little bit of that baby talk, and they like it. They have fun with it. It's just like playing with words. They enjoy it. They like mixing it up because it gives them a feel of the rhythm of the language, what they're going to be learning, and whatever it might be. Babbling is experience expectant. All babies babble. An early sign of language difficulties is a non-babbling 6-month-old. And at about a year, the average babies utter a few words and they just prefer names. Not sure why babies prefer names, but maybe because that gives them words to describe objects. Okay. So when it comes to grammar, word order, prefixes, suffixes, intonation, verb forms, pronouns, and negations, prepositions, and articles, all of these are aspects of grammar. And again, how do you guys pick this up? By listening, by trying out the words, by pointing, by telling the kid this is how it is. That's how kids pick up grammar. It's the interaction. And I've heard some psychologists say that correcting grammar, you can try to correct a kid's grammar and it just really doesn't do anything. They figure out grammar just by going out in the world and experiencing it. Okay. So combining two words is a great leap forward in grammar, requiring new neurological connections. And most babies between 18 and 24 months are able to use two words or more at a time. Okay. We reinforce babbling Because again, babies need to be taught. When they talk, we talk back. We try to let them, we know, acknowledge it, and then we maybe use the full word. Over here is the percent of infants knowing at least 50 words, and over here is the how much time a parent spends with their kids. So as you can see, parents who spend time with their kids, teaching them, look at how many more words they learn than parents that don't spend as much time teaching their kids. So again, this is evidence of social cultural theory. Investing in kids pays off by 2 to 1. So language and learning for behaviorists, the idea of stimulus and response, we are conditioned to use words. We say something right, we get a reward. So again, neuroscience is the most recent method to investigate the development of language. It was once thought that language was located in two specific regions of the brain, the Wernicke's and the Broca's area, but now neuroscientists are convinced that languages arises from other regions as well because there's brain activities going off whenever we go and look at that kind of stuff. Genes and regions are also crucial, but hundreds of genes and many brain regions contribute to linguistic frequency. So again, you're always using all your parts of the brain, but again, there are specific parts of the brain that will, play a larger role. Like, when it comes to vision and things like that. Yes, you have a larger part of the back of your brain, but other parts of your brain are also interpreting that information that's coming from your optic nerve and things along those lines. So again, through repetition, social impulses, and dedicated brain areas, these are all evident toward our ability to learn language. Current studies of the biology of development find that social experiences are critical in awakening and shaping these parts of the brain, though. So again, we have these parts of the brain that are already ready to learn language, but it takes that social investment to really grow those skills. And again, if you lock a kid in a closet for 5 years and never talk to it, it comes to a point where that can be a, experience dependent type of situation. They have to have it. Experience expectant, I'm sorry, experience dependent is when like it's, culturally influenced, things along those lines. So again, through stimulus and response by socio-cultural learning, and then also observational learning, babies just sitting back to using their senses, trying to figure out how everything works. That is how we learn languages. So again, this is just a quick introduction to the beginning of, starting to use our senses, and then your brain starting to structure memories and encode information and encode languages so that you can utilize them. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much.